Let's look at civil rights. And during the Cold War, there's quite a bit of hypocrisy taking place in the United States because as we're accusing the Soviet Union of things like human rights violations and general tyranny towards their subjects, African Americans in the United States have really been reduced to second-class citizens. As more and more people, including African Americans, moved to the cities in the North during World War II, many African Americans end up living in what we would describe as ghettos, as the poorest and most run-down sections of the city. They're facing discrimination in those cities, and they really only have the opportunity to work low-paying jobs. This is what we call de facto segregation. It was segregation in the North as a result of custom and tradition. In the South, we have what's called de jure segregation, which means segregation by law. In the South, we have almost complete segregation of white and black people under those Jim Crow laws. President Truman in 1948 tried to get a permanent Fair Employment Practices Committee. This was a federal organization created during World War II to make sure African Americans got jobs in factories that were filling government contracts. Truman, after the war, tries to make it permanent. He also tries to get a permanent Civil Rights Committee in the federal government. But these efforts are blocked by Southerners, even some Democrats from his party, who were strongly against civil rights. He has these same two initiatives blocked again in 1949 after African Americans helped President Truman pull off that upset in 1948. Truman was successful, however, starting in 1948 in integrating the armed forces. So successful, in fact, that by 1960, the U.S. military, Army, Navy, Marines, and Air Force, is much more integrated than the rest of U.S. society. These efforts make civil rights part of the Democratic Party's platform. And as a result, in elections, Democrats have the support of many African Americans. Let's look next at school desegregation. And school desegregation is going to be an important issue to the NAACP. The NAACP first won victories for African Americans getting into graduate schools, and then they turned their attention to public schools and removing the desegregation in place in many public schools around the country. And this fight is going to be led by NAACP lawyer and future Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. What the NAACP wants to do is challenge a previous Supreme Court ruling, a ruling from 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, where the Supreme Court said separate but equal institutions is okay. What the NAACP is arguing is that separate institutions send a message. They send a message to African American kids that they are second class. And that message to young children is something that they cannot recover from. And it's a message that sticks with them and has a long-lasting negative effect. In 1954, the Warren Court, named after Chief Justice Earl Warren, agrees unanimously with the NAACP. And in 1954, in Brown versus the Board of Education, the Supreme Court agreed with the NAACP's argument. However, they don't want to cause major social problems, so they go on to say that schools should be integrated with all deliberate speed. This is going to cause some problems immediately afterwards. Here's a political cartoon on the Brown decision, and here's a famous photo on the Brown decision. Not everybody is happy with the Brown decision. Border states, the upper South, Maryland, Kentucky, places like those comply rather quickly with the Supreme Court decision. But it's the deep South that really drags their feet. In southern states, we see local citizen protests over the decision. And in 1956, congressional representatives and senators signed what's called the Southern Manifesto, which basically called the Brown decision a clear abuse of judicial power. School boards around the South used a variety of strategies to prevent integration, and one strategy was called pupil placement laws. This would allow school boards to place kids at different schools for different reasons. So maybe their performance on a reading test determines where kids were placed. And oh, look at that. Amazingly, all the African American kids got placed at one school while the white kids got placed at another school. President Eisenhower quickly desegregates federal facilities like shipyards where Navy ships are built and the Washington, D.C. school district, but he says nothing on the slow progress in the South. Some Southern leaders misinterpret this to think that Eisenhower supports their decision. In 1957, one of those people who misinterpreted Eisenhower was the governor of Arkansas, Orville Fabus, who used the State National Guard of Arkansas to block the integration of Little Rock Central High. The high school in Little Rock, Arkansas was supposed to be integrated with African American students. The governor brought out soldiers from the National Guard to prevent them from going in. Well, Eisenhower calls in the 101st Airborne from the U.S. Army to act as bodyguards for those African American students sent to integrate Little Rock Central High. They become known as the Little Rock Nine, those 9 African American students who integrated the city's school district. Eisenhower goes on to sign the Congress's Civil Rights Act of 1957, which is basically the first congressional show of support for the Brown decision. Now, it was drastically weakened by Southerners who are opposed to these changes. Another thing that that was important with this act is that it was filibustered by Strom Thurmond, the Democratic candidate or Democratic senator from South Carolina. He filibustered for over 24 hours, but it was ineffective. The bill still passed. It creates a permanent civil rights commission, and it helps with voting rights to a limited extent. In 1960, the Civil Rights Act of 1960 was also passed, and that further improves African American voter rights, but they are still very limited, and it's hard for African Americans to vote, especially in the South. While some people are fighting segregation in the courts, other African Americans are opposing it with other methods. And you could say this starts with Rosa Parks in 1955, when in Montgomery, Alabama, she refused to give up her seat at the front of the bus and draws attention to the segregated seating in the Montgomery bus system. This is an example of civil disobedience. She is breaking the law, getting herself arrested to draw attention to the problem. Rosa Parks was not too tired to give up her seat. Rosa Parks deliberately did this to draw attention to these segregation laws. That's why we have this wonderful photo of her getting her fingerprints taken. Rosa Parks' actions lead to the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And a boycott is a form of economic protest, and it's especially effective against businesses. African Americans in the city organize carpools, and this continues to draw attention to the segregation in the South. So much so that 1 year later, the Supreme Court rules that Alabama's segregated seating law is unconstitutional. Now, a big reason that the boycott was so successful was the leadership of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And after this success, he is led to create the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC. And this is a civil rights organization that will help lead the fight against segregation. And it's going to be very important in the 1960s. King and the SCLC will use passive resistance. They will not fight back when police officers beat them or come to arrest them. He's going to match the methods used by Gandhi and used by Henry David Thoreau and written about with Jesus in the Bible. And he says this quote about what his plan is. And the purpose all along is to win support from moderate, middle-class white Americans, especially those not living in the South. What he's going to do is make African American protesters and the SCLC look righteous. He's going to make these segregation laws look stupid and silly and out of date. And he's going to make the people enforcing them look like the bad guys. King's SCLC is not the only active civil rights organization. In February of 1960, 4 African American college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, sat down at a segregated lunch counter. They asked to be served like a regular customer, and they were refused service. And they said, "We're not leaving until we get served like anyone else." This starts a movement, and more students join in the next day. Some white students, friends of these students, join in. And there are sit-ins at segregated lunch counters across the South. And similar tactics are used by protesters at churches that were segregated. You have wade-ins at segregated pools, and a lot of these people go to jail. That's part of the plan, because that draws more attention on these segregation laws. Eventually, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, is formed to organize these peaceful, passive resistance and civil disobedience movements. And eventually, King's organization and SNCC will replace the NAACP as leading the civil rights movement. And what this means is that the civil rights movement in America for African Americans will be led by direct action, not courtroom battles. And what that is going to be is more effective. However, it's also going to create more tension and more opportunity for conflict.